The words of the Gospel of Luke, which have been preserved by the Church and handed down to us through the centuries for our hearing, our understanding, and our discussion this morning. About 8 days after saying this, he climbed the mountain to pray, taking Peter, John, and James along. While he was in prayer, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became blinding white. At once 2 men were there talking with him. They turned out to be Moses and Elijah, and what a glorious appearance they made. They talked over his exodus, the one Jesus was about to complete in Jerusalem. Meanwhile, Peter and those with him were slumped over in sleep. When they came to, rubbing their eyes, they saw Jesus in his glory and the 2 men standing with him. When Moses and Elijah had left, Peter said to Jesus, "Teacher, this is a great moment. Let's build 3 memorials, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He blurted this out without thinking. While he was babbling on like this, a light radiant cloud enveloped them. As they found themselves buried in the cloud, they became deeply aware of God. Then there was a voice out of the cloud, "This is my Son, the chosen. Listen to him." When the sound of the voice died away, they saw Jesus there alone. They were speechless. And they continued speechless, said not one thing to anyone during those days of what they had seen. This is the gospel of Christ.
Praise to Christ the Lord.
As I finished reading the poem by Louise May Alcott, I saw David look to Scott, and Scott looked to David, and so like, what is that name? I chose that particularly because I thought it was a wonderful tale of transfiguration. And I love the last line, "and make that child to take a royal soul." I think that's really a great thing that could be said about someone who is, as they sometimes say, passing over to the other side. The whole idea of dying as not being the end, which is what the Gospels preach, but that it is, you say, life is not ended, but change. So there's a change. And if you ask people, what is that change? What does it look like? The Gospels go to great pains to try to give you clues, especially in this morning's lessons, that it is different. It is a transfiguration. It is a way that the faces change so much that one becomes unrecognizable, if you will. I just started thinking about this next book that I'm writing because I have nothing else to do. And it's called The Burning Question, as I think I've told you. And this week you'll find, I'm going to send out to you, I dug up the answers to the questions when I interviewed the people in the congregation about what do you think this means. And the first one was, in what way do you understand the term Jesus, the historical Jesus, and people's response to that's very, very interesting. But one of the things that I'm writing about in the book are those last questions that we have. And one of the questions that we might have, or many people have, before we leave this earth is what is next, yes. But many people say, well, I recognize my loved ones when I get there. And a lot of people are concerned about that. In fact, I had a couple who asked me before they were going to get married, the last marriage I did, Father, they said, we know this is kind of a silly question, but like, if one of us dies right after the wedding, we're flying and everything, I'm really nervous about flying. Will I see her again in heaven, and will she still be my wife? Whose wife will she be in heaven? And Jesus already answered that question. He said, we don't count things like that, so we're not concerned about that, who's married. But in fact, will we recognize our loved ones in heaven? No. Because we will be in a different state of consciousness. We're not going to be thinking about that. That's not a question that's even going to be on our minds. We'll recognize everybody, the idea is, because will know everybody because everyone will be taken up, marked as Christ's own forever. That's what we say in the baptismal service. And we'll have a new type of knowing. So the faces will not be familiar anymore. This is what happened with Moses. Now, I know, Anna, last week you were really surprised, or 2 weeks ago, about the whole thing about Moses being a murderer and all that. Well, here, did you know that Moses wore a veil most of his life? No, I bet you didn't know that. You know, they didn't show that. The Charlton Heston part, they didn't show them. Charlton didn't have a veil on ever. And the whole idea was that once he was in the presence of God, his face shone so much that people could not stand to be near him. He was just radiant. In fact, he was radioactive. And he had to wear, he just couldn't even be in the same, he couldn't be in the same presence. And when he would go into the tent, it was called the tent of knowing, where the Ark of the Covenant was, he would light up the whole tent. Everybody knew to come to church because the tent was lit. Moses was there. If you read further in the book of Exodus and the book of Numbers, that's what happens the whole time. And finally, in the book of Deuteronomy, he goes, because he did kill that overseer, he never gets to go in the promised land. God shows it to him, but he never gets to go in. And who is the person who leads them in? Joshua, which is Yeshua, which in Aramaic is Jesus. There is a connection. Purposely so. Purposely so. Jesus is considered to be many things. He says to the people, who do people say that I am? And they say, well, some people say that you're Elijah. Some people say that you're Moses. Some say that you're the prophet who is to come. But his name was Joshua, Yeshua. And he was to lead the people to the promised land. Now you notice in Eugene Peterson's translation this morning of the gospel, he talks about the fact that they were there together and they were talking to Jesus, Elijah and Moses, about the exodus he was about to have. He uses the word exodus. That should have jumped out at you right away. It would have, to the people who heard it in Greek even, or who heard it in Hebrew, the whole idea of the exodus. Jesus was to be the person who was going to lead them, the people, out of their confinement, their depression, their compression as people who were enslaved by the Romans. That's what they thought. But he had something else in mind. He had a different type of transfiguration in mind. Now this same language that is used about the veil and all that, do you remember about the veil appearing anywhere else? Where does the veil appear also in Scripture? The veil. That's a lot, yeah. Veronica, it's not in the Bible, but it's a good idea. Yes, very good. Good idea. You watch too many movies. No.
The other was during the time of crucifixion.
Yes, what happened during the time of crucifixion? The veil of the temple was torn in two, it says. What does that mean? You can think Louisa May Alcott is difficult. Try that one. The veil of the temple was torn in two. Well, when you went in the temple, there was this veil, this big curtain, if you will, which in the Greek church, you know what that's called? They call it in the Greek church? Anybody here grew up in the Greek church? Who's that? The iconostasis. The iconostasis, where all the icons are. It's a big veil. So you can't see behind the altar where the priest goes. The priest in the Greek church, he goes behind the altar, he disappears. You have no idea what's going back. I think they have coffee, meeting with the prime minister. You just don't know. He's back there for a long time, and you hear all the noise, and you hear all the smoke. You see all the smoke. It all goes up, and they're singing and chanting, but you have no idea what's happening behind there. He could be doing his nails. He's doing, you don't know, but it's being sung the whole time, and everything is supposed to be this. What's happening behind the veil. And that goes back to the old days of the temple. That's what the priests would do. You were allowed to go to the temple in Jerusalem, but you couldn't go behind the curtain. And in the Protestant church, we got it like halfway. We made little altar rails.
So the altar was behind the veil?
Yes. You couldn't see it. In fact, that was true in Roman Catholic churches for a long time. What happened was that this railing here was originally just a rope to keep the people from encroaching upon the priest who was doing the service, or their animals, because people brought their animals to the temple to sacrifice them. So if you went to a service in Jerusalem in the 1st century, when Jesus was there reading the scripture that one day, everybody would have been in the temple with their animals, goats, pigs, well, no pigs, sorry, goats, sheep, lambs, turtle doves, all this sort of thing, and ready to sacrifice them, give them to the priest, who would come out, take your offering, and then go back behind the veil. And then all of a sudden you'd hear, screaming and whatever. Then you saw the blood running down. It would run down from either side of the altar and run into a pool in the middle. And that's how you know your sacrifice has been accepted by God. And what did they do with all that? That's how the priests got their food for the whole week. And they got the community, the Levite community, the people who were in charge of the temple. So you brought everything in. So this altar rail was originally just to keep people back. And then they decided, the people started really, even though there was a rope there, they would still climb over it. So they made bigger altar rails. They couldn't get over it. Finally, they made these big things that went all the way across. They were called rood screens, R-O-O-D, because they had the cross on top of it. It's the holy rood, the cross. And then, because they did that, you couldn't see the altar anymore. Then they built the altar up on pedestals. And then they built the altar up on bigger pedestals. And they wanted you to see what was there, but it looked very funny with nothing behind it. So they built these big things behind them called reredos. And the idea was that churches would compete who had the highest reredos. Reredos meaning, D-O-S meaning back, the back part, the rear part, the rear back. Churches would compete to see who had the highest and most ornate reredos because it was considered to be, the higher it was, the closer you were to heaven. Now you see why the Protestant Reformation was born. People started to think about this and said, we're building a Tower of Babel here. And it doesn't really make any difference how high your reredos is. Really. Ask somebody that at breakfast tomorrow morning. How high is your reredos? See what they say. It didn't make sense. And so all that started getting torn down as part of the Protestant Reformation. They said, this is just excess. Excess. But it all goes back to the beginning of that little veil that Moses was wearing over his face, and how that got interpreted in a liturgical way. How do we represent what happened to Moses, the transfiguration of Moses, in a liturgy? How do we celebrate that moment? Because it was a great moment. The people of Israel had their leader being talked to personally, and he was the only one by God, and he didn't die, because the thought was if you saw God, you died. Why do people think that? If you saw God, you died. It's actually just the opposite reason than you think. Because people died, they said, oh, the euphemism was, they must have gone to see God. You ever heard people say that? They've gone on to their God. They've gone on to see God. Well, they just turned it around and said, okay, oh gosh, that means if you see God, you're going to die. And Moses didn't, obviously. But it was such a transformation, such a transfiguration, that he had to wear a veil from then on. And so people said, this is really an important moment. We have to celebrate it. And that's how the whole Feast of the Transfiguration comes about, which we celebrate on August 6th, usually. But it's talked about here today as a foreshadowing, because this is the last Sunday before Lent. Lent starts on Wednesday, on Ash Wednesday. And it's a foreshadowing of the glory that Jesus is going to have, supposedly. The glory, meaning the shininess that he's going to have in being resurrected from the dead. When he gets resurrected from the dead, the reason that Mary Magdalene doesn't recognize him in the garden is because he has totally changed. Totally changed. He's unrecognizable. And you think that the disciples are really dumb because they don't recognize him when he comes right to the door standing there, and they're like, who is that? And he's walking on the road with two of his own disciples all the way to Emmaus, which is a 4-mile walk away from Jerusalem. So that took a little while. It took at least, an hour and a half to 2 hours to get there. He talks to them the whole time. He's talking to them like they know, and they're saying, this guy seems really familiar. And in fact, they say, Jesus says something to them and says, what's the matter? He says, why are you so sad? And they look at him and say, don't you know what's gone on recently within our community? Our leader, the one that we all thought was to save us, is dead. And he says, oh, really? And he starts to talk about the scripture and so forth. And after he leaves them, after he has bread with them, and then he leaves, then afterwards they remember, yes, I bet you that was Jesus. Didn't our hearts burn when he was quoting scripture? We should have known who that was. And then later, just after that, he appears on the shore, and he's cooking breakfast for the disciples. They have no idea who he is. How could they not know who he is each time? The reason is that he had completely transfigured. They didn't recognize his face, is another way of saying it. It changed so much, it was unrecognizable. Yeah.
Was there any point when he was recognized, when he spoke to crowds or to others?
No.
Never?
No.
Okay.
So it makes the disciples look really dumb because they never recognize him. Now, why would the church tell a story like that? He's going to be here, but you're not going to recognize him. That's very comforting, isn't it? Yes. Mm-hmm. It's good advertising, right? Yeah. That's right. Maybe he'll be here. You never know. Well, there's a lot of religions that do that. There are people who stood out in the desert for days, various times. Jim Jones had people, doing all sorts of things ready for that moment. In 1844, a whole crowd of people, about 3,000, I think it was in Missouri, gathered, and they thought that the world was coming to an end and they were going to see Jesus right then. It didn't happen. That's how the Baptist Church was born.
Yeah.
They were all there and they said, it didn't happen. Why? We must be doing something wrong. I bet we're not supposed to baptize children. No more children baptism. Adult baptism only. We don't have, the people's faith is not strong enough. That's what the preacher said. And from there, all those tent meetings, that's where everybody went out and they held tent meetings. They called them tent meetings because, and they didn't call them cave meetings. They didn't hold them in caves. They didn't call them circus meetings. They didn't hold them in the circus. They didn't call them town meetings. They didn't hold them in town square. They held them in tents outside of town because they were trying to recreate the Moses moment. We've done something wrong. The Assembly of God came out of that whole movement also in California. That whole idea that we must have done something wrong. That's why Jesus didn't come, because we were sure. Well, that's no more fantastic than the fact that the Gospels were written to explain what Paul had said, as we talked about last week. Why was it that the bodies didn't get up and actually walk through the streets? We must have done something wrong. Yes. You know what we did? We misread Scripture. It's not supposed to happen now. It's going to happen in God's time. And there's a second coming. Wait a minute. I didn't see anything in the fine print that said anything about the second coming. There is nothing in the Old Testament, nothing in all of the books we had and everything that said there is a second coming. I won't buy that. And a lot of people left the Christian church. So the Gospels were written, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, to tell the story of Jesus in a new way, to try to explain why there is a second coming. From the time that Jesus dies, somewhere between 33 and 44, and the time that Paul writes the first letter is about 4 years. But from the time that Jesus died, between 33 and 44, and the first gospel was written, is almost 40 years. By the time the last gospel was written, it's over 100 years. So the church was struggling to regather itself and regroup itself in order to try to come up with this new thing that was not part of anything that they knew. There's a second coming. It was hard enough to deal with the first one. In fact, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Seventh-day Adventists, the Mormons, and most Pentecostal groups believe that the second coming already happened. The second coming is when Jesus appeared again. And so they are not willing to wait for a second coming. They say, no, we're going to go with with the oldest text, what we originally thought. And that's why they have services on Friday nights. Because they're going with the old Jewish way of having their Sabbath then. Because they're holding true, they say we have to hold true to the original scripture. And they are literalist when it comes to interpretation of the Bible. Because they believe that if you cannot believe it exactly as they preach it, not exactly as it's written because you get in trouble there, but exactly as they preach it, then heaven won't happen. And the kingdom will not be available to the people, especially to them. The transfiguration will not come about. Yes?
What, you're talking about the Gospels and when they first started written in last year. Where do the rest of the readings fit in? What distinguishes the Gospel from what I know from Catholicism, which is called the Epistle?
The Gospels are a different type of literary genre than the Epistles. The Epistles is just a Greek word for a letter written to. Although if you ask, I've asked kids before, you know, what are the epistles? They said, these are the wives of the apostles. The epistles are the letters written to various churches. So there's 14 epistles in our Bible. They're all written by, 7 were written by Paul. The others were written, 7 were written by we don't know who. But originally they were all attributed to Paul, just as all the books of the Bible, the first 5 books of the Bible were attributed to Moses. And some religious sects today say it had to be Moses who wrote them, but we don't believe that at all. There's many different voices, at least 4 distinct voices in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. So, Paul writes his first letter to the church of Thessalonica in 48. That means he already had to have been there and come back. So somewhere between 48 and 51. So all those 14 epistles, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, Galatians, Ephesians, and so forth, 1 and 2 Thessalonians, all that. They were all written sometime between 48 and 55 when Paul died in prison. We think he died around 55, year 55. Then the first gospel, Mark rather, was written sometime around 70. Luke sometime between 80 and 92. Matthew sometime in between those two, because we know that Matthew and Luke used Mark in order to write their gospel. Some of it's word for word. They were using another source also. John sometime between 110 and 130. Although some people date as early as 90, but nobody thinks that anymore. And all the other ones that are scattered in there have to have been written sometime between 60 or 70 and 100. But this is a long time away from when Jesus died. A long time.
But you refer to them as a genre type of writing. I guess maybe my question should have been what, maybe, it seems to me that more credence is given to the gospel. People stand when the gospel is read.
Right.
And we use the term figuratively, it's the gospel truth.
Truth, right.
It
was a new truth.
To me then, it puts the epistles
as minor stuff.
Yeah, or lesser value.
And they are. They're to be seen that way. Which is interesting because they're older.
And who originated the book, the gospel? The epistle, that's is that a church thing?
It was a church thing, yeah. But it was just a grouping. It's just, they decided that by 325, what happened was Constantine said, I am tired of all this bickering about what is an authentic text and what is not. You know what? Bring me all the text. Bring me all the scholars. You meet with me, and we're going to decide definitively. 325 in Nicaea. And they voted. And they still didn't get it right. And Constantine said, you know what? You guys, this is all guys, sorry. You guys can't do anything. I'm going to decide. And so he decided. But it didn't hold. Because some people said, we're not listening to what Constantine says. Who does he think he is? In fact, he was a convert. Before he even started the whole thing, he was born not as a Christian. He was worshiping the Roman gods and the Greek gods at that time. Until he had his own conversion experience through his mother. And that's when they built the big church there in the big city, which is then renamed Constantinople. And so, who decided? There's a second round. These gospels are different. As I said, they're different literary genre. And what makes them authentic is that they are the best type of advertising, if you will, but they're propaganda, in the best sense of the word. That's what they were called. They have a different voice in them than the letters, which are just written to specific churches who are having specific problems. These gospels are very different in tone, and they are meant to convert. That's what they were to do. They were meant to be so incredible, so believable, telling such a fantastic story, and being backed up by such incredible names like Peter and James, that they had more authentic truth because they were backed up by all the other disciples. Paul, who was he? He was just, again, a murderer. And by his own admission, he says, I am the least of the least. So he would never have considered he uses his authorities, the stuff that's behind the Gospels, what we call Q and L and other, the Gospel of Thomas, these things that were written about the time, he uses those as his authority. He doesn't know the Gospel of Luke or Matthew or any of that. He doesn't even know those people. So,
Don't they always give credit to somebody who's modest?
well, what they did was they tried to give credit. They use a lot of pseudonyms. They try to give credit to whoever thought would best convey their authority. It's sort of like when parents say, when the kids are misbehaving, and maybe this is what Tom says when the kids are misbehaving. He says, you don't want your mother to hear about this. Because, she has the authority. That's the whole idea behind it. So they would give names to whoever they thought had the most authority to try to put forth this word. So let's get back for a second to the whole idea of the Transfiguration. So what this did, and this is why we use it as the beginning of the plan, it transfigured the church. It put a new face on the church. It made the church had to scramble in order to try to keep its members together and say, okay, now what's going to hold us together? Because the church started to break apart. It actually started to break apart the first week. Bless you. That's why I think that we should not be upset about all the different denominations and all that, and the fact that we're not one church. From the very beginning, there was not one church. From the very day. James goes off and does his own thing in Jerusalem. Peter goes off and does his own thing in Rome. The other James goes off and does his own thing in Spain. Thomas goes to India. Supposedly, that's what all the traditions say. Mary goes with John to Ephesus in Turkey and dies there. That's what all the traditions say. But they all had their own little following around them, and they all had their own little writings. And I've given you some of those writings in the past in last year. As we were looking at the different writings that were around. So, do you realize that by the time that it came to Constantine and they had to make a decision, there were 500 books to choose from, at least. And there were a lot of other ones that were named in the Gospels and in the other writings as books, which we've never found. Yeah.
They were obviously all different languages, too. They weren't all written in Greek.
They were. Almost all written in Greek.
Oh, okay.
Because that was the language of a scholarship.
Can I ask?
Sure. What difference does it make?
Yeah.
So what? That's good for Morris's question. My systematic theology teacher says, now that you know all this, so what? Well, I'll ask it back to you. So what? So now that you know, now that this has been explained to you, and you understand the reason we cut backwards and forwards, oh, so what? Does this make a difference? Why bring this up? What is the point in that the Gospels or the lessons this morning want to raise this just as before we go into Lent? Make you think? Yeah, always all the shot goes to your head. Why talk about this now? Why talk about it at all? Is it worth knowing? Is it worth knowing this?
I think it is. This is human nature. I think this shows what we are about.
Yeah, I think it shows how we got to where we are, or at least part of it. There's a lot of people cannot move on unless they know where they've been. Because they say, wait a minute, I'm not willing to go on to the next place because I haven't filled in the holes, the potholes from the past yet. I need to do some road repair. And once I've done that, then I'm willing to go down your road. But until I repair my own road, I'm not willing to do it. So part of the reason to answer your question, and maybe that hopefully answer some of your questions as well, is that it's really hard to give up, or give over the things you've already learned if you don't realize what the potholes are. Because how do you know that anything you're going to learn in the future doesn't have the same potholes? Are you willing to trade one thing for the other? What is it that you want? What truth is it that you really want to seek? And I think the reason that this is important is because it comes down to the whole thing is, what is it that we should believe? Should we believe what the church tells us? That's a rhetorical question. I don't want any answers now. Should we believe what the church tells us? Should we believe what's been handed down to us? Or should we be thinking people who are trying to discern what truth there is in all that's being said? What truths lie here and how do we determine them? And I think that's really an essential question for all our lives. For the stuff that you've been going through with the shelter and the various churches, you have to be asking yourself at some point, where is the truth in all this? Why are we doing this, in other words? What will be gained by having this knowledge? Will I be recognizing or be recognized by somebody in heaven? My mother used to say to me, your reward is in heaven, whenever I asked for payment for having swept up the floor. Yeah. You know, what's the payback? And the only way that we can understand that, I think, is that if we have a way or the tools to begin to discern what is true. And so much of what we've been told is not true. Or, another way of putting it, it has been changed a lot. It is not the original message. How do we get back to the original message? And how come, as you pointed out, the original message, which is older than the Gospels, is not the gospel truth? So what I try to do is I try to take us back to, and my job in Lent, is to try to take us back to that time, to that week, to try to tell, what I'm going to try to do in Lent, is try to give you an idea of what Jerusalem was like, what the air was like at the time that Jesus supposedly appeared on the scene.
We can't go back to the original message. It's impossible. 2,000 years have passed, we've changed, the world has changed, and what spoke to the people then doesn't have meaning for us today. We have to find our own message.
I don't know that that's true. I think that what spoke to people today, there are some things that still have meaning for us today. You're right, we can't capture what they particularly exactly were thinking, maybe not. We can. I mean, there are a lot of texts that are extant from that period. We can read some of them and see what people were actually thinking. They're not all Gospels, and they're not all letters, but they are around, including a lot of those ones that we've read before. Some of those really fantastic things that I presented to you during time before Christmas were written before the Gospels were written.
Well, that's the same thing as saying that if in 2,000 years people read the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, that they're going to know everything about what people were thinking in the 20th century.
Yes, I think that's true.
Well, it's not true though.
Yeah, but that's my truth.
It's a very false
Yeah.
representation.
But they'll have an idea of how some people were thinking. And the fact that it was a popular book will let you know that many people thought that was something that if they weren't thinking, they wanted to think that way. Why do some books become bestsellers? How do you write a bestseller? That should be our next, Yes, the publisher gets lots of money. But some stories are just very dynamic. They yearn to be told. They yearn to be shared, and they last. I think what's really interesting about if you want to know about the truth part of it, the test, at least according to Scripture, as to what was true was whether it lasted.
Well, I was just going to say that our group is called an interfaith group. So we have people with all different, come from all different backgrounds, and we visit all different churches, and we visit all different kinds of services, and that is one of the problems for us, is that, every different denomination you visit says, we are the way, we know the way, and everything from, Wicca to Catholicism, and so as individuals, I can only speak for myself, is that you do, after a couple of years, just your brain kind of frizzles and says, and I always think of what Jesus did say, who do you think I am?
Right. Well, I try to say, notice in the liturgy, I've even changed some of the words in the last month to say that we are a pathway, not the pathway. We are a pathway to God. Surely.
I was just going to say, if you think about the meeting from 1 Corinthians, it goes way, way back. We're still using it in wedding ceremonies. We're still using it in those concepts there that are on us, I think.
Right, and that was
what happens in the historical context.
And when Paul wrote that he was just repeating an old hymn that was already extant. And when you go through some of these writings, you can see the different literary genres that are in them. So another one is hymns. And Paul, in a lot of his letters that he writes to the churches, he uses hymns. Just like as I wrote a letter to you about this weekend about David Joran's mother dying, I used a poem by William Penn. I mean, that poem, our thought process, about death is only a horizon, and horizon is nothing but the limit of our sight. That's 400 years old, that thought process. But it's still pretty good, I think. Or still comforting, perhaps, to some people. And I think that we can try to get into a first century mindset. That's my job. I'm going to try to take us there in Lent. A first century mindset, so that we can see how people might have been hearing these words, and why it is that they were able to put them down in such a way, or why it was the church was able to preserve it in such a way that we still are here this morning talking about it. Now, a lot of people say that we shouldn't be talking about it at all. It doesn't make any difference. It means nothing. But I think it does mean something. And I think it also does mean, we are so affected by it that every part of our life, even you've discovered how much it means in a backhand sort of way. You have to now muddle through all the controversies of 2,000 years or more, 5,000 years or more, and try to make it work in order to keep a shelter running. Seriously. If you want to know, I know this may be no comfort, Katie, but if you want to know why you have so much trouble, you're trying to undo 5,000 years of prejudice and thinking and so forth. I mean, really, or more. Right, and so when the days that you get frustrated, I want you to stand up and say, my priest says it's 5,000 years, I cannot undo it all, I can only work day by day. I'm an accountant, and I can tell you that you can only do it piece by piece, or add up. Or if you're a dietitian and they tell you it took you 25 years to get that heavy, you can't lose it all in 1 week. That's what Weight Watchers says. Okay, well they're using the gospel in order to preach their message. You can't undo it all. But I in my time on earth, in my time with you, I'm trying to undo some of it and trying to take you back to how it is that people thought. Because if you don't understand how people think, or how you got to what is actually ruling your life, then you can't change it. If you want to. I'm not saying anybody wants to. But if you want to change your life, then you have to understand how you got to where you are. You cannot move on without that. You just can't. That's the whole basis of psychology. and psychiatric work, but it's also the basis of the gospel. They try to explain how it all happened. That's why the Gospels went back and reclaimed the whole story about Jesus' birth and all that, which Paul doesn't even know. Paul's the first writer, but he doesn't mention anything about the baby. Doesn't even mention Virgin Mary's name. He calls her the mother of Jesus. Doesn't even know her name. Doesn't know any of the early stuff. So the Gospel said, oh, we got to go back and claim that stuff, because if we don't know where it came from, how can we believe in it? Isn't this Jesus, the carpenter's son? Yeah, but it was more than that. Well, where does it say so? I want to see the fine print. Okay, I'll write it. They couldn't find it, they wrote it. I'm going to write it down, so you know, so future generations know. And people did. People were very bold, they just wrote it down.
So how dare you change it?
How dare I change it? You sound like my seminary professors. Because I've studied it. And I'm not changing it as much as I am trying to give you a greater sense of the word, of what it means, and how it got there. Eugene Peterson does a great job, I think, really, of trying to capture what people were thinking and the parlance of that moment. And a lot of his translation, especially his translation of 1 Corinthians this morning, is very, very, very good. It really is. But even the things like just bringing up the word the Exodus this morning, that is a brilliant translation.
Can we get him here?
Eugene? He speaks often in New York City or at the seminaries. I can let you know when it's next going to be at one of the seminaries. He's very interesting to talk to, and there are videos that you can find through the site of The Message, which is where this comes from, that you can watch him talk to groups. He's very, very, very knowledgeable. He started out just he had only did a translation of one epistle. That was his job. People liked it so much, he said, why don't you do another? And then he said, why don't you do another? So I said, well, I might as well just do the whole thing then. I'm going to do it. And he did. And it's wild. I had trouble from that from Baltimore. Can you help me with that? W-I-L-D-L-Y.
Wildly.
Very good, thank you. I knew it. You have to have a singer to sing. Popular. You have a final question, Anne?
I'm struggling with this text. I'm struggling to fit our discussion into the message for today. And I want to just double check with you if I grasp anything of what we're talking about today. So, in this text, they came along and then they saw Jesus and Moses and Elijah, at least they thought so. And when they put voice to that, God descended upon them and they became very quiet and became speechless. So I'm trying to figure out how this looking in your past to where we are standing now fits into this. And do I understand this right, that they are being presented with the beginning, middle, and end, so to speak, of the Christian journey, and then suddenly they're being told, but only the end is important, and this is what we're going to say?
What happened is that he takes them to the mountaintop, I think, so that they can have an historical experience of all that has ever happened in the world to this point. And everything that Jews thought were important appeared before them that moment. Elijah and Moses, the two greatest prophets that ever lived in Judaism, and God. They're all right there in a cloud, and you're with them. So not only your past, but all the past of the entire world is now with you in one moment. So they're left speechless. What are they supposed to do? Now that they understand their entire past, and the entire past of the whole world, back to the beginning of creation, now that they've been privy to that, now what do they do?
Probably so odd.
For a while. And then when Jesus dies, they say, now we know what we're supposed to do. We don't understand it now, but now we get it. But they had to, some people cannot go forward unless they have the whole darn world explained to them. They need to know not only what happened to them, but what happened to every Jew before that, to every Christian before that, to every Muslim before that, to all the people before there were Muslims, to the cavemen, to the whatever. They have to know back to the beginning of time. How far do you sometimes just want to strangle somebody and say, how far back do I have to go before it's okay, and you'll let me talk? How much do you need to know? Have you learned enough yet? Is it enough yet? Have you ever had that discussion with people? You want to hear any more? When people talk to you about it, say, I want to know everything, and you start to tell them, say, oh, stop, that's too much information. No, you wanted to know? I'm going to tell it all to you. And even then, knowing it all, it is still not enough. So the question comes up, to answer your question, how much do we need to know before we believe? How much do we need to know before we go on? You tell me what it is that is holding people from making the step to believe. And let's deal with that. And most people will tell you, it's my interviews with all of you told me, that there was so much that was not understood from the past, there was no way to get to the future. And that was a real problem for me in trying to do the interviews, because as Joanne and I talked about, although she has some thoughts on this a little bit different, for me there was no collective past, because as a church, when I came here, there were two people. So there was not a St. John's experience that we could talk about, that we all shared. We can do that now, but we couldn't then. So how do you move people into the future when they don't have any sense of their past? And I think that's one of the reasons that the church isn't packed every Sunday. And some people said, oh, it's because a lot of people want to go where they're told what to do. But I think part of the problem is that we are starting over. And the starting over period takes longer than 13 years that I've been here. It takes a lot longer in order to build it up again from 2. You can't build all that temple in that short of time. You just can't do it. It's just not possible. And what I try to do is I'm trying to let us understand what our past is, both historically as a church and as people who listen and read these Gospels and supposedly live by them, or are affected by them by the other people who are living by them throughout the world, and we have to deal with every day, and they're preaching to us about what they think and so forth, so that we can move forward. And we can do it with intelligence, with thinking, and with some knowledge that we didn't have before. And hopefully that will be transfiguring. Yeah.
Rusty, I think it would be very interesting to compare what people think today compared to what they were when you spoke to us
3 years ago? Yes.
I'm sure there would be a difference.
I'm sure there would be. Well, I'm going to put up. I'm going to send it out to you on Tuesday. So look for that. And if you think you recognize anybody, you're wrong. All the names have been changed to protect the innocent. No. What's interesting was when I went back and told people, even a year later, what they had written, they said, I said that? No, I could never said that. I said, I have it on tape. I'm going to play it back for you. Okay. It was interesting to see where we were and how and where we come from. So that's what we're going to do more of in life.